Relax. Trust in the Most High, He got your back. Praying fast when you under attack.
The question that I have is, Rabbi, what do you make of white Jews disassociating themselves from European identity? I don't know if you saw the whole controversy with the Ami magazine. And I did have a brief discussion with Rabbi Chaim Samuel about it, because he also posted an article from a blogger. He basically agreed that Ashkenazi Jews, or just Jews in general, should identify as Middle Eastern as opposed to European Jews.
I disagree. If you're African, if you're European, why can you be an African Jew? Why can you be a European Jew? Why can you be a Latin American Jew? Who cares what they say? The Jewish people aren't a nation like the French and the Irish are a nation, okay? We're a nation made up of belief that encourages actions. So we could be from all over the world. As a matter of fact, it speaks better for our religion as a testimony to other people that, you know what, we're not just Middle Eastern. We're Asian, we're Native American, it sounds very insular to just say that we're Middle Eastern. Yes, in terms, now like we live in the Middle East. The vast majority of Jews also now still don't live in Israel. I don't know why they would make that argument. Am I making sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense. It was just interesting because it started with the magazine. I don't know if you saw the cartoon for the kids where basically you have these, I guess, seemingly black Africans, and they have these seemingly white people, I guess, detained, and then they're asking him like, oh, are these the same Europeans that took our land? And then these Jews responded, or the people responded, well, we're not white, we're actually Jewish. And that kind of sparked a bit of a...
That's so silly.
Right.
That's so silly. The vast majority of Jews in America are white. The Jews in New York, Ashkenazi Jews, are white. I'm of the opinion that the vast majority of people who are Ashkenazi are actually descended from converts. Not necessarily from Khazaria, but not excluding that idea. Why should people run away from that? And to be true, no Jew ever calls himself European. They'll say Ashkenazi.
I think, in my opinion, I think the reason why they disassociate themselves from identifying as a white European, I think it's because maybe they recognize that white Europeans have an ugly history of colonizing other countries or other lands and enslaving people, because
the Jews also had a part to play in that. Jews were slave traders in the transatlantic slave trade and had slaves. There's letters found in the oldest synagogue in America, I think it's in Rhode Island, of Jewish slave owners asking halachic questions regarding how they treat their slaves. Jews also own plantations. Now, if they want to run away from that, they're doing it in a dishonest manner. The vast majority of Jews didn't live in the North. There's a good book on it called The Sins of Our Fathers that talks about there's this famous slave trader. His name was De Lopez. Portuguese. They very much had a big part to play in the transatlantic slave trade, and Spanish Portuguese Jews ran most of it. Yeah.
And also, so if I'm not mistaken, isn't the term Middle East or Middle Eastern like a term that was given by the Romans? So if that's a fact, isn't it ironic that they want to identify as Middle Eastern? Because you're essentially taking a European-based term to identify as.
I'm all for making Judaism inclusive, open to everybody.
More color.
Why should I want to just limit it, saying that we're all Middle Easterns? We're a mixture of different races and colors, and what unites us are our actions and our beliefs. It doesn't matter how you look.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think it was crazy, like how a magazine that was designed for children could put that out, to essentially push an agenda.
I actually think that people who come from that region are a lot more primitive than people who came from Europe. And I see this how the Middle East has more of an influence towards Europeans than Europeans have had towards the Middle East. When Americans make Aliyah, they start adopting Middle Eastern customs. Like all these mannerisms, even all the food in Israel is not Jewish food. This is Greek, Turkish, or Middle Eastern food, but it's not Jewish. Right? But nowadays we think, oh, falafel, shawarma. This is not Jewish food. There's no such thing as Jewish food outside of maybe gefilte fish and some other European dishes that are just culturally Jewish. But we don't have food outside of matzah. Okay.
And when I was doing my PhD at the Graduate Center for City University of New York, my advisor, Jane Gerber, who is a expert in the Sephardic experience writ large, suggested I go to Jamaica and look at archives there. And so I said, yes, why wouldn't you? Right. Yeah. And there I found Last Will and Testaments in abundance. And it really, I became enamored with these sources, and it really changed the type of historian I was, what kind of text I was interested in, what aspect of Jewish life I really wanted to uncover. And also Jamaica became a very fruitful place because the more I searched, I realized there were no surviving communal documents from Jamaica from the 18th century. They'd all been destroyed.
Things that make you say,
an earthquake in 1907. So having this abundance of probate records, I realized that maybe the only way to really uncover the lives of this local community. So I've been spending the last several years reading wills and trying to reconstruct the history of a whole community based on just those documents.
Wow. So if you ask the average American Jew how many Jews ever lived in Jamaica, they'd say just a few vacationers for vacation. So what's the truth about that?
Well, that's not inaccurate today.
Yeah.
And today there are about 200 right. Jews in Jamaica, which actually makes it quite a large Caribbean community. And the community today is made up of an old guard of Portuguese, and there's a lot of Israelis there, and also a lot of people of color who are connected to the community either by having a heritage of having been Jewish or descended from a Jewish person, or they are attracted to Judaism. So that's the makeup of the community today. In the 18th century, the community reached a peak at around 1,000, which still doesn't seem like a lot. And it was actually smaller than other Caribbean communities. So Curacao and Suriname all had larger Jewish populations in the 18th century. Those were Dutch colonies. But Jamaica alone was bigger than all North America put together. So the communities like New York and Philadelphia and Newport and Charleston, which is so heavily in our focus of the early American Jewish experience, really that didn't amount to as many Jews that were in Kingston and Spanish Town together, not to mention all the Jews in the west coast of the island as well.
So that's really the beginning of the story of this region then. So what is the dynamic in play with Jews and slavery in Jamaica?
Yeah, so this is obviously a huge aspect of what I write about, and the reason I write about this so much is because it was a very conspicuous aspect of the wills. As I was reading the wills, you find that slave populations are being bequeathed en masse, and in that they're being named individually. And also you see a lot of evidence, sometimes very direct and articulate, of concubinage or relationships, sexual relationships with women of color, both enslaved and free, and then incorporating their children and to some extent into the family through voluntary inheritance. So that all made me realize that we need to address the issue of Jewish slave ownership. Over time, I've also realized that this has been the subject of competing tendencies one coming from a anti-Jewish position like the Nation of Islam that wanted to make the case that Jews were overly represented in the slave trade and were overly abusive to slaves, and that's not true. In fact, it's kind of puzzling why Jews weren't more involved in the slave trade, since it was a totally open type of endeavor that had no guilds or protections like that. And Jews owned slaves to the same extent that everybody else did. So there were no particularities. Now this stands in contrast to a rival kind of mentality where Jews must have treated their slaves better. Because how could you be sitting at a Passover Seder saying we were once slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt while being served by slaves? But people did that. And so some scholars reached an apologetic conclusion in the 20th century saying that Jews manumitted their slaves more readily or treated them better. And I find that no position really captures the truth. So in fact, I crunched the numbers in my wills, and I found that slaves were about 11 times more likely to be bequeathed than they were to be freed by Jews. So it's very uncommon to actually free manumit slaves. And there are cases of Jewish abuse of slaves. And then there are plenty of cases of manumissions. In one case, he manumits a Jewish slave owner manumits his quote-unquote mulatto son because of the love and affection he has for him. So there are cases of sort of sentimentality as well. But Jews are like everybody else. There are some abusive slave owners, and there are some that own slaves because that's what's done in the colony that they live in. Yeah.
So if it's the case that Jews were more or less following the same patterns as anyone else living in that area, is it your understanding that that's the same case for the Jewish North in North America and the Jewish South in North America, that essentially they operate no different than those in the region?
Yeah, I think that's where we are in the scholarship on this issue right now, and there's some new scholarship coming out, especially focused on Suriname, where Jews had a whole plantation community of their own, autonomous Jewish plantation village called Yodin Savannah, where they enslaved thousands of Africans. So there's been a lot of new research, and I think where we are writ large is that the Jews show no particularity in their slave ownership than anybody else. And that's true in the American South as well. And there were, proportionally to the numbers, because there were more Jews living in the North at the time of the Civil War, but proportionately there was as much support for the Southern cause among Jews as there were as there was for the cause of the North. And ironically, the rabbinate was quite split on the issue of emancipation of slaves. And so in one case, Morris Raphael in New York wrote a very famous piece, an editorial, where he defended slavery because, after all, the Bible endorses slavery, and the Bible actually sets out very clear parameters by which a Jew should own slaves, or how a Jew should own slaves. That was opposed by, he was more of the Orthodox, you may call, spectrum, or a supporter of like Isaac Leeser type of Judaism in America, whereas the Reform took a more progressive policy towards that. So people like, I think his name was Bernard Felsenthal in Chicago, and famously David Einhorn, a Reform rabbi, who was a student, if I'm not mistaken, a student of Kaufman Kohler, or I may have it. Actually, I think I have it the other way around.
Okay.
Right, an important foundational figure in Reform Judaism in America. He was in Baltimore, and he avidly championed the cause of abolition. He was actually run out of his own home in Baltimore for doing that, because it was a slave supporting.
So all of the Reform progressive abolitionists would have been in the North or relatively close. We wouldn't be finding them in the South, right?
Well, theoretically, in the South there were positions. So let's say the furthest south maybe have been Cincinnati, where someone like Isaac Mayer Wise towering figure in American Jewry, took a kind of middle position where he wasn't willing to say that slavery was antithetical to Judaism, but found some shared cause. One thing that nobody was an abolitionist.
Oh, really?
And that is because the abolitionism, the supporters of abolitionism in America had a very anti-Jewish rhetoric associated with their cause.
Even Quakers did?
Yeah,
Oh,
it's true. And William Lloyd Garrison also had said some quite hostile things towards the Jews.
Yeah.
So you find that even rabbis like David Einhorn, who is probably the most supportive of emancipation, never really called himself an abolitionist.
So it wasn't a difference in values as much as sort of identity.
Exactly.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Now, of course, there were Jews of color in Jamaica, and so how does the Jewish community in Jamaica, particularly Jewish slave owners, relate to Jews of color? Are they primarily Jews? Are they primarily people of color? Did Jewish white folks own Jewish people of color? So what did all that look like?
Yeah, so this is the $1 million question, right? What is the Jewish identity? How do you define it for mulatto Jews, as they're called in Suriname, or Jews of color, people with Jewish ancestry? Did they identify as Jews? Were they incorporated in the community? Were they incorporated into the family? And it's hard to answer that question in Jamaica because there are no communal records. But there are communal records in Suriname. So this is what we know about Suriname, was that these Jews were part of the community. They were called mulatto Jews in the records. But they were not able to achieve the status of Yechidim. So they are Congregants, which were lesser status, where they were paying taxes to the community but couldn't receive communal honors. And in fact, there were moments when they had burial that was in somewhat of a less choice area of the cemetery in Yoden Savannah that led to an attempt of what probably was a learning academy, a yeshiva, called Darchei Yesharim of mulatto Jews, to try to maybe secede from the community or to assert an independence from the community. That was sort of an abortive attempt. That's because really a tax issue more than a racial issue, perhaps. It's hard to say. But what we can say is that they were buried in separate parts of the synagogue, separate parts of the cemetery. There were differentiations in their burial plots, and they had a clearly marginal status within the community. Yet they were totally identified as being Jewish.
Being Jewish wouldn't have been any street cred to avoid slavery, though, right?
You mean to avoid being enslaved?
Enslaved, yeah.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Right, not necessarily. It gives you some street cred, let's say, in Suriname, because at certain points in Suriname's history in the 18th century, especially into the 19th century, Jews become the dominant white group. And so being associated with them ends up giving you some status. So enough where you had your own confraternity, the Darchei Yesharim. So what we can say, though, communally, is that they definitely had a marginal status. Yet racial concerns were probably more important than halachic concerns. It doesn't really seem to come up. Like if their fathers were Jewish and their mothers were women of color, free or enslaved, did that mean that they had a Jewish identity, or there were efforts to convert them?
Right.
So I answer this question on a familial level, since I don't have communal records. And what I find in wills is you do have some cases when fathers, I would say, even try to coerce Judaism among their children of color. So they'll say, I give them this inheritance. I recognize these are my children. They'll say reputed children, or they'll say my natural children, so they'll qualify them in some way. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily because they're of color, but because they're not legally recognized. Because although there are no anti-miscegenation laws in Jamaica, it's socially anathema to marry women of color. Mm. So they don't have legal status. So they're called reputed children, right, or natural children. And so in some rare cases, you'll see attempts to coerce their conversion. Yeah. And in those cases, so I give you this inheritance only if they agree to learn in the academy and stay Jewish and have a Jewish identity, in which cases they often separate them from their mothers, fearing that the influence of the mother may deter the efforts to incorporate them into Judaism. Other times it's more of a suggestion, or it's more inferred. In the cases where, let's say, the women, their mothers of these children have taken names like Sarah Israel. In one case that I find would suggest that she was a convert, and in those cases, the children all seem to have no distinction among other Jews. Their names are identical and things like that. They could be called Isaac Furtado. You would assume he's a Jew. You may not realize that he's a Jew of color.